Hi gay, happy Pride Month. We are sashaying away with deals at the Butter Barn. This month I wanted to make a more specific video for Pride than I did last year, one discussing a particular aspect of the queer community, how they're represented, how their presence in games has been rapidly changing, and what it even means to represent them. I am, of course, talking about the allies, the truly unsung heroes of the queer community. Actually though, today I want to talk about non-binary characters in gaming. While the NBs traditionally don't get a ton of representation, they've become part of the discussion more and more as people's understanding of the broader queer community continues to expand. And if I had a nickel for every time a major online multiplayer shooter released a non-binary character in 2024, I'd have at least 2 nickels. Which isn't much, but it is approximately 2 more than I would have had in pretty much any other year, and that does merit some discussion. Obviously, both Valorant and Overwatch have had queer characters before, and games like Apex Legends have actually had non-binary characters since day one. But the nature of those dual releases of Venture and Clove in the current cultural climate meant they made a bit of a splash. Clove and Venture both being announced and then released pretty much side by side meant that a lot of gamers were exposed to the concept of a non-binary character all at once with them, and while it meant there was a lot of shitty discourse out there, it also meant that there was a lot of genuinely interesting discussion about what it means to design a character whose relationship with gender isn't so easy to categorize. So much of character design relies on gender signifiers in terms of body type, clothing, color, posture, accessories, hairstyles, and more that it poses a really interesting question. What does non-binary representation in video games look like? Now, just to get a couple things out of the way before we start. I am not non-binary, and so I'm not speaking on behalf of the NBs on this in terms of what they would deem good representation. We're just talking about how a character being non-binary creates unique challenges and opportunities for someone trying to design them. For another, my comment section is not the place to debate the validity of non-binary identities, or be a weird freak about queer people in general. And for one last thing, if you're going to comment on this one, I do really ask that you watch the full thing so you're not arguing with a point that I intend to circle back to later. I know with contentious topics it can be easy to fire off a hot take 5 minutes into a 25-minute video, assuming I can get this down to 25 minutes, but I hope you're willing to actually hear me out before popping off. Anyways, enough rambling, let's just get into the video. Starting with Part 1. Where do you start? Unlike most other marginalized groups who start to get some representation, NBs are in a somewhat unique position when it comes to this topic. People who want to start introducing more NB representation are going to have to pave some relatively new ground rather than being able to look back at a legacy of non-binary characters to figure out where their character fits into that catalog, what worked and what didn't. Like, if you wanted to make a black man, or a gay man, or a black gay man, there was a point in time where you didn't have a lot of similar characters in media to look back at for inspiration or to learn from. However, as time progressed, more and more characters that met those descriptions have been created, and there are also just real-life people that you can look back on. And more of them have been created by people who were meant to be represented rather than by outsiders who are maybe caricaturizing them. However, for non-binary people, they're at a point right now where there aren't a lot of fictional characters who are explicitly non-binary to look back on as clear inspirations. And many non-binary characters of the past were typically robots, aliens, or some other form of non-human where their lack of binary gender was meant to reflect some degree of a non-human nature. Gender and sex are such fundamental parts of how we experience human society that we treat binary gender as a fundamentally human thing, a fundamental part of the human experience. And for a long time, that meant that a lot of media treated existing outside of the binary as something fundamentally outside of the human experience. In plenty of media, non-binary identities are also used by masked characters as part of their disguise, not really being non-binary as much as being an unknown quantity. Still to this day, there are characters whose non-binary identity is used as a way to indicate that the character is just a total enigma. We might not know their age, their nationality, their race, or even their gender. Instead of an M, an F, or an X as a gender marker on their ID, it's just a big question mark. However, non-binary characters also face challenges that a lot of other marginalized groups don't. For one, our modern understanding of non-binary gender identity is relatively new. There have always been cultures all over the world that have had concepts of third genders, gender fluidity, or other similar concepts, and there have always been people who have struggled to identify with the binary or have existed outside of it. But in terms of the specific label of non-binary as we use it today and understand it today, we're in relatively uncharted waters. This means that, aside from a lack of fictional characters to draw inspiration from, it can also be hard to pull inspiration from real-life figures because the variety of defined and undefined non-binary identities that have existed throughout history don't necessarily neatly map onto a modern understanding of the concept, and this is something that's relatively uncommon. Like, even before gay representation in video games had become more common, there were still gay characters in other media, and even before there were gay characters in other media, there were still gay people in the real world that creatives would likely know of or even know that they could pull inspiration from. It might not have been good representation or positive representation, but it could at least be based off of something that people were aware of, that they could conceptualize. Hell, even if they didn't actually know of any gay people around them, they would still likely be able to have an idea of what a gay person was that they could operate around. Even if they didn't really know much about a culture around it, it was a concept that was easy to process, because being gay is ultimately relatively straightforward. It's sexual attraction, which someone who's straight will still understand, it's just to the same sex instead of the opposite sex. And even if you don't like it, you probably aren't going to be super confused about the concept. Non-binary characters are in a pretty unique position because the entire concept of being non-binary is just a new one to a lot of people. And to be clear, this isn't to say that this is like a new thing or a fad. I don't want that to be the point that's coming across here. That is not the case. There isn't really any common cultural touchstone for what being non-binary is, either in terms of specific people or characters that might come to mind, or even just broader stereotypes or characteristics of the group. This means that even if a character designer themselves is well-versed in non-binary issues or is non-binary themselves, they have to still present that character to an audience that broadly is not. Lifeweaver being queer didn't require a bunch of explanation because his entire character design reflected a lot of stereotypes or aesthetic shorthands to indicate that he was queer. Venture being non-binary isn't in the same position because there isn't an obvious visual shorthand for being non-binary, and that's in large part because of our next topic. Part 2. Defining the undefinable. Non-binary identity is fundamentally not a single static thing. It's a broad umbrella encompassing anyone who doesn't identify their gender with either male or female, boy or girl, man or woman. There's a few things that can make it hard to say anything definitive about being non-binary, but the most obvious is that there's no shared start or end point for NBs in a way that there often is with most other identities. Like if you are a black person or an Asian person or an indigenous person, you are who you are from the start, and you are going to share that with other black, Asian, or indigenous people, respectively. Gay men will generally be assumed to be attracted to women until stated otherwise, so there's a shared experience of people assuming or expecting you to be attracted to women until you state otherwise by coming out or by presenting in a stereotypically gay way. This isn't to say that it's simple to do that, but it does mean that there are certain shared experiences that will be fairly universal to gay men across race, class, or other aspects of our identities. My experience is not the same as a gay black man, but there are enough aspects of our experiences that are similar that we can be grouped together under a shared identity as gay men for at least some purposes, and can make connections on that basis. The most direct comparison here would be binary trans people who transition from one binary gender identity to the other. While trans people will have a hugely different range of experiences for a lot of different reasons, there are still going to inherently be things that are shared experiences for a group of people who were raised and socialized as girls only to transition and live their lives more authentically and accurately as boys, and vice versa. We are vastly oversimplifying here to avoid getting stuck down a rabbit hole, but I hope you understand what I'm getting at. Most people who share an identity will share some fundamental experiences that make it possible to make some at least broad statements about the group as a whole. Non-binary people aren't really like that, because being non-binary is inherently a much broader concept. While gender is complicated even within the binary, with plenty of discourse about what it means to be a man or a woman, going outside of the binary means that you really don't have anything to build off of that's concretely shared. There isn't necessarily a shared experience with gender because non-binary is an identity as well as an umbrella term for a lot of people who have more specific labels for their own gender identities that exist just outside the binary. Non-binary people don't all start from the same position when it comes to gender either. An NB might have previously identified with being male or female, and where you start from will obviously affect how you experience gender even outside of that binary. For some people, a non-binary identity is the endpoint of their experience with gender. For others, they identify as non-binary while they're in the process of a larger investigation of their own gender identity, where they don't know where the endpoint is yet. There's a tendency to treat people in that latter group the same way that bisexuals are often treated, with the idea being that they're just using the identity as a baby step on their way to an actual identity, and it's important to acknowledge that that's neither accurate nor fair and is actually just kind of shitty. While there are plenty of people who identify as bi or non-binary because they've recognized that their experience with sexuality or gender is not perfectly cis-heteronormative but don't know the extent to which that's the case and so identify with those labels while they figure it out, these are also just labels that plenty of people have. However, I really don't want to get sidetracked here. We're talking specifically about character design, and you might be wondering how all of this plays a role here. The reality is that it plays a role in everything, because just about everything about character design is gendered to some extent, and often in ways that don't really have a neutral middle ground. Everything from body proportions to face shape to musculature tends to skew a design either male or female to the audience, because the audience has been taught to look for those things as indicators of gender. You can try and find a middle ground, but it just isn't always possible. Like, okay, breasts are probably the most obvious one. If a character has breasts, that will be seen as an indication that they're female to the audience at large, even though we all know that there are plenty of cisgender women who just don't have breasts for any reason, whether it's a medical issue that required breast tissue to be removed, or just not really developing visually noticeable breasts. Or I don't know, they might just be wearing a sports bra. Like, there's any number of reasons why somebody might visually not look like they have breasts. However, if a character doesn't have breasts, then it's going to be treated as a male gender indicator. Even though, again, there are also cisgender men who grow breasts for a variety of reasons, often including things like hormonal imbalances. There are also intersex people who just will develop in a way that doesn't align perfectly with the binary. However, when it comes to non-binary people, an NB might have breasts or they might not, and either could be the result of medical interventions or not, depending on the individual NB in question. Without explaining to the audience that the character is non-binary, they will interpret the presence or absence of breasts as a gender indicator, and the only real middle ground here is to dress the character up in such a way that it obscures their silhouette enough to hide the chest and make it ambiguous. However, that comes with its own challenges too. Namely, that it would not only limit your character design options in terms of clothing, but also your character's personality. Like, okay, if we were dressing up a cis character with big baggy jackets and sweaters to hide their silhouette, what would we be trying to communicate about that character to the audience, and what lessons about that character are the audience going to absorb? Maybe a degree of shame or insecurity in their body that they're trying to hide it. As somebody who put on some weight during COVID, I wore many a sweater in the summer because I didn't like my body, and I think a lot of other people can relate to that experience. Or it might be a deliberate effort to avoid being sexualized, like Billie Eilish's old style of big oversized t-shirts that she explicitly said were meant to hide her body to avoid being perceived that way. Or it might just be that they like big bulky shirts, or they feel uncomfortable in more form-fitting clothes. Dressing a cis character like that wouldn't be an inherently bad thing. It doesn't inherently mean something negative about them, and it can be used to communicate something interesting about them. However, if you dressed every cis character like that though, it wouldn't communicate much because it would become a default indicator of being cis. NBs aren't a monolith, they're arguably the furthest thing from it, and while some will certainly wear outfits like that, plenty will also wear more form-fitting clothes for any number of reasons. Maybe the particular outfit that they picked matches their identity best, or maybe they just like showing off their body, or maybe they just don't want to wear bulky outfits because it's hot out, or maybe they just like the outfit that they want to go with that day. While there's definitely nothing inherently wrong with putting your NBs in the oversized t-shirts, if that's your only go-to for NBs, it limits what their clothing can say about them as characters. In fact, you risk unintentionally carrying over some meanings from what that kind of clothing is usually understood to mean. A character wearing a sweater in summer or a t-shirt to the beach is generally seen as a sign that they're trying to cover up their body for some reason, often because of insecurity. And if you give all NB characters that treatment, you risk creating the idea in your audience's mind that NBs are, as a group, insecure about their bodies or should be expected to cover up any typical indicators of gender about themselves if they want their identity to be recognized. Historically, this has been pretty common in how a lot of non-binary characters have been designed, fully covered up, mask and all, to avoid showing anything that might give off any gender vibes. A character like Bloodhound is a good example of this, and while I don't think Bloodhound is bad in isolation, they're also not what you want every NB character to look like. Flack from Borderlands 3 hits that similar trend but with another layer, just make them non-human. Flack is a robot who has a similar design philosophy to Bloodhound, but their non-binary identity is tied to them being a robot that just doesn't approach gender the way humans do. Now, is that an inherently bad thing to do? No. Exploring gender in this way can lead to interesting places. However, when so many of your NB characters are presented this way, it tends to be based around them being an outsider, not part of regular human society, but existing on the fringe. And that's not really great. And so while it's not bad to have these character designs as part of the whole, it's also not good if these sorts of options are the only things you've left yourself with after trying to eliminate or cover up any potential gender indicators. A challenge for character designers on this front is that you're trying to navigate gender indicators in a way that's representative of a group whose gender identity is not attached to either of the binary categories that all those indicators are usually sorted into. Boobs or no boobs, pink for girls or blue for boys, skirts or shorts, all that stuff. As a result, there are two general trends that character designers will follow for non-binary characters. Part 3. The most obvious options. The first option that you tend to see a lot is character designers treating gender identifiers as a point system, like they're starting from 0 on a scale that ranges from -100 to +100, with -100 representing a pure female presenting character and +100 representing a pure male presenting character, and they're trying to stay as close to 0 as possible. In this instance, they're doing it by trying to average things out. Does your character have a masc presenting body? Well, give them a feminine haircut and painted nails and that'll counterbalance it. Does their color scheme incorporate a lot of typically feminine colors like pink and purple? Well, give them a more gruff, masculine sounding voice and it'll average out. This approach comes from viewing gender identity as a spectrum, with male and female being the two endpoints on either end and non-binary people trying to balance as close to the middle as possible. In a way, this makes sense, and a lot of NBs will deliberately incorporate male and female gender identifiers in their presentation in order to communicate that they aren't presenting as either. I'll put it to you this way. Think about an RGB color scale where we treat the red end as male and the pink end as female. If you're taking this approach, you might see red and orange as the definitively masculine options and pink and purple as the definitively feminine options, and you're assuming that NBs are trying to get as close as possible to that teal shade in the middle. The alternative is to take the opposite approach to get to the same endpoint. Avoid anything on the spectrum that's too close to one end or the other and only try to incorporate character design components that are as close as possible to that teal range. Pick a character name that's gender neutral, pick a color scheme that's gender neutral, pick an outfit that's gender neutral, etc. Again, many NBs will aim for something like this. Instead of choosing to swing big and pick options from both extremes of the spectrum, they'll focus as much as possible on picking options close to the middle of the spectrum to avoid giving anything for you to latch onto as a clear indicator of gender. However, this approach falls short when it comes to character design for a few reasons. First and foremost, because gender isn't really a spectrum. Most gender identifiers are perceived as binary because we're used to seeing gender as binary, and so if you're approaching NBs as just trying to hit equal amounts of male and female gender identifiers or avoiding them altogether, you're going to end up with a bit of a jumbled design. The problem here is that you're really making too many assumptions. Plenty of NBs don't see themselves as teal, or even as existing somewhere along this spectrum to begin with. Lots do, and I am not trying to diminish that, but plenty of NBs have a relationship to their gender that's just more complicated than that. For some, it skews more heavily to one side of the spectrum or the other, or they might have specific scenarios in which they'll prefer masculine or feminine gender identifiers, or they might want gender-neutral options through and through, but many NBs also express their gender in a way that doesn't just fit neatly onto that spectrum. I know a lot of NBs personally who've mentioned that they view their identity as being more like boy plus or girl plus, where they generally identify with all the typical gender identifiers of one side or the other, but also reach out beyond that. And how does the spectrum even begin to approach that? How do you conceptualize that under the spectrum? These are people whose gender identity is like the equivalent of trying to find red with purple stripes and teal polka dots on a spectrum. And that's in large part because gender itself is not static. Our expressions of binary gender change over time too. Something that was once an indicator of masculinity, like high heels, is now generally an indicator of femininity. How long should a man's shorts be before they don't look like men's shorts to your extended family on a camping trip? How skinny can your jeans be before they look like women's jeans? Or how baggy should they be? The answer has changed over time. If we treat gender like it's a spectrum, we're assuming that there is a definitive male endpoint on the spectrum and a definitive female endpoint on the spectrum that NBs can balance between. But the reality is that both masculinity and femininity are themselves ever-changing concepts that fluctuate depending on class, race, culture, nationality, social trends, and more. It's not useful in general to treat gender like a range of values from totally masculine to totally feminine where non-binary people exist in the middle, because both masculinity and femininity are vague, nebulously defined points that constantly shift around, and non-binary people are deliberately engaging with gender in a way that's meant to go beyond that false binary. Another important aspect of this is that we're kind of approaching this from the perspective of what can non-binary people do to communicate to non-binary people what their gender identity is? And while gender is social and performative and all those other things, it's also deeply personal. A non-binary person is deliberately not choosing to identify themselves with a binary understanding and perception of gender, and is instead choosing to operate outside of that binary. Sure, many will choose to present their gender in a way that makes it as easy as possible to communicate their gender identity to the average person to avoid being misgendered or having to answer annoying questions about, okay, but aren't you really a guy or a girl? You wore insert any gendered thing today. And there are a lot of NBs who just genuinely, sincerely, authentically present in a way that sort of aligns with that. This doesn't mean that those people are performing to cis-het people or whatever else. It's a broad range of things, and sometimes how people authentically present themselves is a way that's easier to digest than others. However, non-binary people are not in general basing their identity in just trying to communicate their rejection of the binary to society. It's about personal expression, it's about a personal relationship to gender, and it's about not playing by the rules that say pink is for girls and blue is for boys. Not by insisting on wearing equal percentages of pink and blue to cancel out the gender of it all, and not by refusing to wear either pink or blue to avoid the gender of it all, but by choosing to wear whatever color they want based on what they want, not based on whether it's a boy color or a girl color. Plenty of NBs are also trying to figure out what being non-binary means to them. For the same reasons that character designers will struggle to pull from some grand library of past non-binary characters to learn and build from, many non-binary people are forging new paths in terms of what it means to express gender in a non-binary way in our current understanding of the concept. It's a journey that involves a lot of experimentation, and it's one where people are often having to balance personal expression with personal safety. The reason why both of these options are, at best, incomplete approaches to creating a non-binary character is that they're still trying to approach NBs through the lens of a binary. NBs are, in a lot of ways, in a pretty unenviable position here. They're effectively trying to explain that their favorite color is red to an audience who can only see a dog's color spectrum of blue to yellow. How do you explain a color to someone who can't perceive it? How do you explain what it means to exist outside of the binary to people who insist on trying to analyze that existence in terms of its relationship to the binary? This might feel like a frustrating response when it comes to character design. Like, a lot of this video has been about what not to do or what's wrong, but not really about what to do. A lot of the video has been really dancing around a different question than the one in the title, and that's because we need to answer that question first if we're ever going to get anywhere. Part 4. What is non-binary then? Non-binary identity can be expressed as anything because it's a relationship to gender that is not dependent on a specific set of gender identifiers. Someone who's non-binary might choose to wear clothes that generally align with a common understanding of one binary gender or the other, or colors that do the same, or they might mix and match. Non-binary character design doesn't require you to go 50-50 between male and female indicators, nor does it require you to wholesale refuse to engage with anything that carries a gendered connotation. Clove and Venture are really good examples of this to look at because of their contrast on this aspect of their designs. Clove's design is reliant heavily on butterflies, pink and purple colors, and more traditionally feminine accessories and clothing in general, while Venture's design is very neutral, with everything from the color scheme to their haircut to their clothing not being clearly identified with either binary gender. They have two totally different approaches, but neither is failing to be a non-binary character in terms of their design. At the end of the day, non-binary characters don't have to have a definitive character design component visually. There's not the definitive NB approach, the definitive NB uniform. There isn't a traditionally non-binary clothing option, or traditionally non-binary hairstyling option, or traditionally non-binary color palette, because being non-binary doesn't mean just one thing. You can have non-binary characters who hit a mix of masculine and feminine indicators, or characters who avoid either and generally go for neutral options, or characters who do broadly present almost exclusively with typically masculine or feminine indicators while still being non-binary, or anything else. This makes them a hard group to design a character to represent because you don't really have any obvious visual aspects that you can rely on, like how black characters will have certain hairstyles or male characters will have some broadly recognized typical body types. But you also don't just want to attach the non-binary identity to a character that was designed as a cis character because gender does have clear visual indicators, unlike something like sexuality. I mean, some characters are visibly queer and that's part of their character design, like Lifeweaver, and some are visibly queer in a way that makes it frustrating when they aren't explicitly made queer, like Claude from Fire Emblem Three Houses, who everyone agrees is clearly a bisexual man. When it comes to gender, it's really not as simple as just pulling a Soldier 76 or a Tracer and attaching a non-straight sexuality to a character whose design doesn't really scream their queerness. You can make Soldier 76 gay, and it works, especially because part of the fight for gay representation has been over wanting representation that accurately reflects the broader population. And that includes men who reflect stereotypes as well as those who don't, because someone can be gay even if they don't look gay in a stereotypical way. And there are a lot of people who will feel seen by an older gay man who's traditionally masculine. However, when it comes to gender, it's so ingrained in us to see characters as either male or female that you don't want to leave it unstated or understated if your character is non-binary. And if you don't make it clear, then people won't even think to consider it most of the time. However, then you reach the question that this video has been trying to answer. How do you make a non-binary character? How does a character designer design a character to indicate that they're neither male nor female in a world where everything seems to come with gendered connotations? Like, nail polish is a gender indicator to most people, but so is nail length and shape. Hair length is a gender indicator, but you can have short haircuts that are feminine and long haircuts that are masculine. Being muscular is often seen as a gender indicator, but there are buff feminine character designs and slender masculine character designs that go against that. As a character designer, this might feel infuriating. You might genuinely, sincerely, truly want to create a character that is a good representative of non-binary people, and none of this is an answer that can be tangibly applied to the process of character design. And the reason for that is that we're still looking at this through a binary lens. A non-binary person is not only identifying outside the binary in terms of what's on their driver's license or a passport, but is actively perceiving the world differently in terms of how things are gendered. A non-binary person isn't going into the non-binary section of the clothing store. They're finding clothes that match their own gender identity from across that store, regardless of how the store itself or society at large would label that clothing. They're not choosing a haircut by searching popular men's haircuts or popular women's haircuts, they're just looking for a haircut that they would like. For some, that's going to mean finding a gender-neutral haircut, but it doesn't have to be gender-neutral because a non-binary gender identity is not the same thing as being gender-neutral. When it comes to making a non-binary character, it's not about trying to find some hidden non-binary option or put every slider in the character creator right in the middle. It's about engaging with the character design process in a way that doesn't use binary gender indicators as the guiding light. When deciding on a body type, it's about deciding on a body type that works best for the character without thinking about whether that body needs to convey masculinity or femininity. When deciding on a hairstyle, it's about prioritizing the hairstyle that matches the character rather than trying to find the most gender-neutral haircut imaginable. Part of why this is a unique challenge for NBs is that there is no way to define, the definitive NB character. Clove from Valorant, Venture from Overwatch, Bloodhound from Apex, Flak from Borderlands, or hell, even Sasha from Inescapable aren't fundamentally wrong ways to design an NB character. I mean, Sasha is, but that's because Sasha is just Sombra, but that's a whole other thing. The biggest challenge here for character designers is that the general public's understanding of non-binary people is so limited and the existing library of NB characters is so small that it can be hard to know where to start. How to represent an authentic non-binary identity, how to avoid making a character who's not a stereotype but also isn't so non-stereotypical that NBs can't identify with them, and how to do all that in a situation where successfully representing non-binary people is just inherently going to require a whole lot of characters to be created and you have the unenviable task of having to try and be one of the first ones to enter the mainstream of gaming. Characters like Clove and Venture have great designs, but they're inherently incapable of representing all NBs because being non-binary is just so broad, and the decisions that are made when designing both of them will inevitably be a little reductive while influencing how mainstream gaming audiences are going to perceive non-binary people. Gender is complicated even just in terms of the binary itself. What it means to be a man or a woman is nuanced, challenging, and very much so constantly in dispute by people who want to broaden, restrict, or just shift those definitions. Our race, religion, culture, society, class, job, family, everything influences what gender means to us and how we interpret both our own expression of it and the expression of others, and it's always changing. That binary is so all-encompassing in terms of how we perceive ourselves and the people around us that it can be really hard to wrap our heads around the idea of existing outside it at all. And even for people who are non-binary themselves, there isn't some simple, straightforward answer of what being non-binary means to them or to everyone. It is an incredibly personal thing, and this can make it especially hard for character designers trying to design NB characters because you have to try and conceptualize how that character perceives, processes, and presents themselves personally as if you were in their shoes. Non-binary characters in a lot of ways just expose how hard we rely on gender almost as a crutch in character design by forcing designers to engage with gender indicators as aspects of self-expression that aren't tied to a clearly defined binary gender identity, both in terms of how their designer conceptualizes a character as well as how they communicate that character to the audience. To answer the question posed in the title, how do you make a non-binary character? The answer is simple. Just make a character who's non-binary. The challenge comes from exploring that character and figuring out what being non-binary means to them in terms of not only how they understand themselves, but how they express themselves, and that's something that doesn't have an easy answer. However, on the flip side, that also means that there's an absolute mountain of opportunities out there for brilliant, creative, innovative character design when it comes to non-binary characters that we've only barely begun to tap into. And I can't wait to see who joins characters like Clove and Venture in the future. And that's where I'm going to wrap this one up. Thank you for watching, and be sure to like, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff if you haven't already. This was a really fun video to make, and I've had a lot of conversations with friends over the last few months about what it means to try and design an NB character that have really helped me figure out what I wanted to say with this one. As well, if you enjoyed it, you should consider becoming a channel member for $5 a month. Members get to vote on one video topic per month, and over the last few months have been responsible for all these videos. For June, the topic they picked was How Your Turn to Die Nails Branching Narratives, which will be coming out at the end of the month. And if you buy a membership now, you're also going to be able to vote in the July poll. There are 3 returning topics: hero bans aren't the solution, Blizzard's Panopticon isn't working, and what Overwatch tells you to care about and why it's a problem. As well as 2 brand new topics as decided by some of my top donors from the Donathon that'll be revealed closer to the end of the month. Lastly, thank you to all my channel members: Miniq, Olesp, Cage the Orc, Fish Toast, Alex Stone, Nemo the Survivor, Destiny, Yoshi of the Wire, CatLover192, Sourdough, Aluma Riley, It's Peggy BTW, Cadence, Windex the Great, V, Deleathers, Gavost, Marsh Alice, Crimson Cyclo, Good Guy Luis, Cactine Kushler, Ikri, Hallucigeno, MV, The Only Enigma, and Hazmat Bad at Games. Whether you're a member, a subscriber, or you just clicked on this video out of curiosity, thank you very much for watching, and I hope we'll see you around again soon.